All right, well, welcome everybody. Really excited to have all.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, well, good morning and welcome everybody to this month's edition of Beyond Compliance, our webinar and podcast series. I'm Brian Sharp with SafetyChain Software, and we're really excited to have you join us this month, in particular because this is a somewhat special edition of the series that we are partnering to co-present this with our friends over at Eurofins. And so first and foremost, I want to thank all of them for jumping in to help us not only bring this to a bigger audience, but to bring a really important topic we'll be talking about today called Zone 1 testing. Do you dare? And this will be presented by a very highly sought after presenter on this topic, Dr. Douglas Marshall, whom I'll be introducing here in just a moment. Go ahead and bring us to the next slide there. For some of you, we recognize this might be the first time you're joining us for the series, and so I want to tell you a little bit about the Beyond Compliance series. If you're new, we see a lot of familiar names and faces out there that are joining us. But if you're joining us for the first time, this is really meant to be an educational series that we bring in thought leaders and experts, practitioners that are really out there in the trenches doing some of this work. And the idea is to bring really tangible topics where you can have ideas you take way back to your own facilities. So tips and strategies, trends, best practices. The idea today is not to just talk at a high level, but really talk about the work you're out there doing every day that's so important, and hopefully give you something to go back and implement in your own companies. So really try and design these topics around you and for you. And I think today you're going to be really in for a treat as well. If you want to go ahead and move it forward there for me, Genevieve. I'm having a little bit of a hard time seeing on my screen there. So let's see, what do you have that up on your side there, Genevieve?
Yes, can you see now?
There we go, thank you. So as part of the series, thank you very much. The series we've been putting on for a while is a sponsor, and again, I really want to send a special thank you to folks over at Eurofins. We've been talking about doing this for a while. I think by the response, given Dr. Marshall a hard time, I think he's got quite a fan club on this topic. It is an important and serious topic, but we really appreciate the support from Eurofins on this. So you'll hear a lot of great stuff that applies to the amazing work they do in the area of testing and consulting. We're on the software side of the house, so the idea is we help with maybe some of the areas to help us do these types of things better, faster, smarter, with software around food safety, quality, compliance. So however either of us may be able to help you, we're certainly interested in learning more about what you're up against and how either Eurofins or SafetyChain can help you out after the webinar. Genevieve, if you want to go to the next one, I'll cover a few housekeeping items here. Great, thank you. So a couple of things just to touch base before we get started. One is we try and do a somewhat informal but professional format. So the idea behind that is, I'd like to say if we were all sitting around at a trade show chatting, what would we be talking about? How would we be talking about? And that's really the approach we take to these. So one of the keys with that is asking questions. We want this to be for you. So we encourage you to fire away your questions in the Q&A box there. We'll have a dedicated session at the end. We anticipate with the number of people, this was a record number that registered, as well as this type of topic, probably going to elicit a lot of very specific questions. So Dr. Marshall's been kind enough to offer to respond to all of those that we don't get to during the webinar afterward, and anything that are applicable to the technology side, we'll certainly jump in and help as well. You'll also notice that only the panelists are displayed. So when you send in your messages, they do come to our team behind the scenes, and we'll be sifting through those. And one of the most common questions, we'll try and get out of the way here, but we are really excited to be able to share both the actual presentation deck and the recording shortly after the webinar. So next day or two, you'll see an email with links to both of those, and you'll have a chance to be able to watch and listen to those or share them with your colleagues who weren't able to join today. And last but not least, we are on a webinar. We have a ton of people on today. So in case there's any issues with audio, there's two ways to log in, by phone or by computer. So if you're having any issues Sometimes the easiest go-to move is just to swap from one to the other, or the good old-fashioned log out and log back in. But if you are having any technical issues, we do have a team behind the scenes. Just send them over via the chat or the question box, and we'll do our best to help you out with all of that. So with that, Genevieve, we'll go ahead and move forward here, and I'm going to introduce you to the man of the hour that all of you are really here to listen to today, and that is Dr. Douglas Marshall. Dr. Marshall is the Chief Scientific Officer with Eurofins Microbiology Labs. He is also co-founder and director of the Food Safety Institute, an integrated consulting and analytical services company affiliated with Eurofins as well. He's a frequent consultant to a number of government agencies and private companies. His research and expertise has been featured in popular press venues such as Consumer Reports, Fine Cooking, USA Today, Fitness, Health, Men's Health, Chemtech, Nature Science Updates, and a whole lot more. He is frequently invited speaker and author with over 250 publications and over 150 invited presentations. His scientific research and outreach interests focus on improving the microbiological quality and safety of foods. He's been the recipient of a number of awards for his scholarly efforts, including the Mississippi Chemical Corporation Award of Excellence for Outstanding Work and the International Association for Food Protection Educator Award. He's a fellow of the Institute of Food Technologists, member of the board of directors, an inaugural member and chair of the International Food Science Certification Commission, and a founding member of the Global Traceability Center. So it goes without saying, we have the expert in the room. We are so grateful and excited to have you, Dr. Marshall, join us here today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. That was very kind words. And I do want to thank everyone here who has taken some time off of their busy schedules to spend an hour or so with us. And I do want to thank SafetyChain for the collaboration on this, because this is a very important topic to the food manufacturing industry. And we get a lot of questions about Zone 1 testing. So I'm not going to be able to address and give you personal advice on a 1-hour webinar. But what I'm going to share with you really are some questions you should be asking, and maybe give you a little bit of thought process in terms of how to come to a decision on how to play this out in your own facilities with your own products and your own process risks that are perhaps unique to yourself. I'm going to catch up here on the slide deck, if you'll be patient with me a second. For those of you unfamiliar with Eurofins, I just have one slide here to tell you a little bit about who we are. We're the world's largest laboratory testing network. We have over 450 labs in around 45 countries, and we serve the food and dietary supplements industries in doing a lot of the food safety and food quality testing that's required by those companies' interests. Again, although we are a very large company, we have lots and lots of local laboratories. So we give you the combination of a local neighborly presence with a global portfolio. Genevieve, we do have one polling question for the audience to get the thought processes flowing here. So if you could please post that question, and everybody please provide a quick response so we can move on.
Okay, I'll give us a few more seconds for everyone to respond. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. So here are the results of the poll. Looks like 40% said EVAC. And Doug, you can continue on with your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody for being on part of the EVAC bandwagon as an indicator. So there are a number of issues related to failure to have a good environmental monitoring program that has led to recalls and outbreaks. These are just a few examples. Some are historical, some are somewhat contemporary, but there have been major recalls associated with salmonella in peanut butter, salmonella in hydrolyzed vegetable protein, and some outbreaks with Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat meats. And then both pathogens have caused environmental contamination of ready-to-eat cantaloupe and led to fatalities in both circumstances. So the bottom line is, if you don't get your EMP program worked out well, because this is something that's designed to tell you whether or not your preventative controls for controlling pathogens are working. So a robust environmental monitoring program includes some of the following contemplations. So first of all, you need to establish what are the goals of an environmental monitoring program. And for most folks, you are really trying to find pathogens, or if you are having allergens as a food safety risk requiring preventative controls, then you may also be interested in looking at your allergen cleanup changeover to make sure that that is effective. But you really want to do a seek and destroy mission on these kinds of food safety risks. The other reason why you may want to have a robust program is you can use environmental monitoring to assess the effectiveness of some of your GMPs, specifically related to cleaning, sanitation, and employee hygienic practices. Next question you want to answer is, where are you going to do this testing? Most practitioners will advocate using a zone approach, and we certainly do that. And you know, the complexity of the zone approach is at your discretion. It could be a very simple two-zone approach. You either have direct food contact surfaces would be the first zone, and then all other surfaces that don't have direct food contact would be a second zone. There are other examples out there where people are doing 3-zone, 4-zone, and however many you would like. But generally speaking, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be dealing with what we call direct product contact surfaces. So this is a surface in a manufacturing site that has direct contact with food product or has potential for direct contact for food product. So this could be overhanging structures such as light fixtures, catwalks, pipes, and so forth. If they, you know, gravity does work, as last I heard from Newton, and any contaminants that are on those surfaces, if they fall, they're going to fall on a direct product contact surfaces. So you could potentially consider those as direct product contact surfaces. And then all other surfaces, we'll call those non-contact surfaces. So an environmental monitoring program has some of the following attributes that are really important. Number one, you need to have a baseline sanitation program that not only includes, you know, the SOPs for cleaning and sanitation, but you should also think about why you're doing the sanitation program, and do you have areas that are difficult to clean and sanitize and could be potential harbor sites for pathogens or unwanted allergens. Then you would design an environmental testing program around the sanitation program to be able to collect data points to assess effectiveness. So you can either use it to validate your cleaning and sanitation program, meaning, is what I'm doing, does it really achieve the outcome I expect? You could also use environmental monitoring to do routine verification testing to prove that every time you did this process, that it in fact is giving you the outcome you expect. You want to also then take those data points and evaluate those results and do a root cause analysis whenever you have an out of specification environmental test sample. And then from that root cause, then you would design corrective actions to mitigate any out of spec situation that is unacceptable to you. So one question people ask also at the beginning is, what should I be looking for? And in this particular scenario, this is a food processing environment, is an open air dehydration facility. The actual product here are peppers, And it doesn't take your mind long to wander to figure out that there are potentially many locations in this food processing scheme where environmental contamination is possible. Obviously, the product is on the ground, so you have potential for vermin contamination. Personal hygienic practices such as direct hand contact, and in this case, foot contact with product, probably is an environmental cross-contamination risk. So any pathogen, I'll just say, could potentially be found in any food ingredient or any environment. Okay? However, we tend to simplify the targets based on the scenarios involved in the manufacture of the product. And the reason for that is the following. Our target pathogen for control in environmental cross-contamination is usually Salmonella in a dry or a low moisture food processing environment. And the reason for that is Salmonella is very, very resistant to die-off when it is in a dry state. So it can persist in an environment for many days, weeks, perhaps months. And if it gets back onto product, it doesn't necessarily have to grow in that product to make someone sick. So unlike many of the other gram-negative pathogens, things like Campylobacter and Shigella and E. coli, Salmonella is usually the most hardy of those. And so if you are controlling Salmonella, the argument is you're probably also controlling the other gram-negative pathogens. In contrast, Listeria monocytogenes is the target bacterium for environmental monitoring in high moisture food manufacturing facilities. And the rationale for this organism as your pathogen target is Listeria can establish harborage sites in a facility, and if there's moisture, food, and the right temperature, it could actually multiply and grow in that niche, and then that niche or harborage site could be shedding this pathogen into the environment during the normal course of operations. And then if allergen control is your food safety hazard that you think environmental monitoring is worthy, then really what you're looking here is the prevalence of that allergen on direct product contact surfaces. So the whole premise of today's talk is what should we be testing for on these direct product contact surfaces? So there's a raging debate out there whether indicators are better than pathogens or are pathogens better than indicators. So if you are setting your objectives for your environmental monitoring program, an indicator is an analyte, microbial species, or a group of organisms whose presence or level on those surfaces gives you some indicator for the possible presence or population levels of a pathogenic microorganism or an unwanted allergen. And it allows you to get a data point that says my GMP was working effectively for controlling this food safety risk on those surfaces. And then a couple of other definitions for us before we move along is what is an out-of-spec situation. So here are some examples. One routine way to measure whether sanitation was done effectively is to simply do a visual inspection of those surfaces. If you see visible soils on those surfaces, then that would violate your visual clean rule, and that would force you to go back and do a remediation of those surfaces. If you're using indicators, and here are some common indicators, I did give you that polling question to begin with, at least for Salmonella, and you'd be using ATP, aerobic plate counts, coliform counts, EBAC counts. If you're targeting allergens, you might be using protein and so forth. So whatever action limit you place on what is acceptable versus unacceptable, if you exceed that action limit, then that's considered to be an out-of-spec environmental test result. Obviously, you could look specifically for the pathogen of concern, or you could look for the allergenic protein of concern. So again, back to zoning. So by definition, for the purpose of this talk, A zone 1 area or a zone 1 surface is an area in the plant where there are direct product contact surfaces that are exposed to the processing environment after a kill step and before final package closure. So if your process does not have a kill step, then every surface in that facility that has direct product contact should be considered a zone 1 surface. Zone 2 surfaces and zone 3 and 4, these would be surfaces in that facility that don't have direct product contact surface. And in a 4-zone scenario like this, what you're really looking for here is the proximity of those surfaces to a zone 1 surface. So something that is in close proximity, you may want to call that a zone 2, things that are further away, things like walls, ceilings, floors, etc. You could consider those zone 3. And then zone 4 would be areas outside of the direct food manufacturing facility or rooms. So things like employee welfare areas, offices, and so forth. Another question that we repeatedly get is, do I really need to do environmental monitoring? And so here's a little bit of guidance that helps you answer that question. And really, the main way you answer the question is when you're doing your hazard analysis, you need to understand what the risks are of your products, your ingredients, and your process. Because if you do your hazard analysis correctly, then that will help you answer what is my risk for environmental contamination of my product. So here are some examples. If the product is ready to eat, you need to ask, is there a lethal microbial treatment that will be applied to that product prior to consumption? So in other words, is the end user going to apply a kill step, so let's say it's a cooking step, before they consume that product? And I'll give you an example. If you're a raw meat manufacturer, you're making the assumption that the final customer, whether that's a food service operator or an actual consumer buying it from retail, that they're going to apply an appropriate kill step to that product prior to consumption. Now then, if you are a flour manufacturer, we've seen some examples where consumers may not apply a kill step. And so, you need to know what the intended use of your product is to be able to perhaps answer whether it is ready to eat or not. What is that risk of being a ready to eat ingredient or material? Next comment here is post-process contamination. So is the manufacturing process fully enclosed? So here you could maybe think of a milk pasteurization facility where really the entire process is enclosed until you get that filler tip going into those bottles. So the risk of environmental contamination is very, very limited to one portion of that process. And then you would want to look at the cross-contamination risk of that exposure area. Another question you might want to ask is, has the process or a similar process ever been documented to have an environmental contamination issue? Certainly in your facilities, but also other facilities manufacturing similar products. Is there a historical precedence where environmental contamination has been an issue? And then in terms of verification, are you doing routine wet chemical sanitation that would require routine verification of effectiveness? And so if the answer is yes, then that routine verification will involve probably zone 1 testing. Now then, let's say you are somewhat reluctant to embrace the idea of testing pathogens on a zone 1 surface, and you come up with some sort of rational reason for that. And I put together a couple of slides here that are some examples that I've heard out there amongst people manufacturing foods for not testing for zone 1 surfaces for pathogens. So before I go through this list, I want you to think about this. If your greatest risk is pathogens on a zone 1 surface, and you're not actually looking for pathogens on a zone 1 surface, Is there a logic breakdown in that rational thought? And I would argue if there is, then maybe these reasons aren't very good for you to justify not doing zone 1 testing. So let's go through there. Never done this in the past, and I haven't killed anyone yet. So again, if you've never looked, then you really never know whether or not you are sending out contaminated product. Fear of a recall if pathogen is found. Management says never find anything on a zone 1 surface. So now you've got conflict of interest in your company because management is telling you don't find a problem and I'll reward you for that. And there are some circumstances where I've seen where quality gets a performance bonus if they never find anything on zone 1. I've never been challenged by an inspector, an auditor, or customer when they come in and do an audit. Or it's not my problem because I outsource this to our contract sanitation vendor. Or I outsource this to my supply chain because I rely on that supply chain to never send me any contaminated materials or ingredients. My product doesn't support growth of pathogens. Well, that's fine, but if the pathogen survives in a material, does it still have risk? My product is not considered to be ready to eat. This is one of those slippery slopes because we've had some recent recalls. Let's say blanched and frozen vegetables. Recall a year or two ago, those frozen vegetable manufacturers had a large recall because of the presence of Listeria monocytogenes. My visual inspection is good enough. If the surface is clean, it looks clean, that's a good enough data point for me. ATP testing is good enough. Or we can continue that with indicator testing is good enough. I have some people say I do finished product testing for pathogens, so I don't really need to do environmental monitoring because if there's a problem, I'll find it in that end product test results. I react to zone 2 out of spec results by then looking at nearby zone 1 surfaces. So I make the assumption that what happens on zone 2 happens on zone 1, and I respond accordingly. You can't tell if a positive test result is due to a transient contamination rather than the presence of a resident contaminant on that surface. So in this case, the argument is Salmonella just floated in when the loading dock door was open and it landed on the surface. And so, you know, the odds of it making someone sick is really remote. So I don't need to do any more testing on those surfaces. All right, let's turn the page and talk about reasons to test for zone 1 pathogens. So the first one here is my product or process has been historically implicated in outbreaks involved in environmental contamination. So it doesn't necessarily mean your products and your process. It means if there's ever been a historical event where your product or someone using a process similar to yours has had environmental contamination that's led to recalls or outbreaks, then are there any common practices that you're doing that are similar to what happened during those other occasions? And if the answer is yes, that should elevate your risk profile of your product or your process. Second one, my product is ready to eat, so environmental monitoring is expected by regulators, auditing schemes, and customers. So in this case, it's not anything that's your choice. It is expected as the cost of doing business. You have a personal or company desire to test your greatest risk surfaces for your greatest risk food safety hazards. So again, being very prudent. Finished product testing is a needle and haystack approach, so the odds of finding something are low. So I would much rather find it in the environment before I ever find it in finished products. Indicators may be poorly correlated with pathogen prevalence. And in this case, if you're doing a terrific job with your GMPs, a terrific job with your preventative controls, then the odds of you finding pathogens should be quite low, and the odds of finding indicators should be quite low, at least below your spec limit. So maybe you need to do that periodic pathogen test just to make sure it's not there. Too many outbreaks have been occurring here recently by manufacturers that have ignored Zone 1 testing for pathogens. Let's say you desire to do robust investigational sampling to find problem hotspots before they are an issue for you in your facilities. Past history suggests there are niches in the facility that harbor pathogens. You've recently undergone plant construction or new equipment installations, and that disruption of that plant environment could dislodge some of these pathogens from hidden harbored sites. So you really want to, again, get on a seek and destroy mission. I'd rather do my own super swabbing before the regulators come in and do theirs. So again, being very proactive and really measuring what the true risk is in your facility is perhaps a good idea. My product is ready to eat and I don't have a kill step in my process. So in this case, the entire facility is considered to be ready to eat. And so you could have lots and lots of Zone 1 surfaces that are risky. You want to actually use this environmental monitoring data to tell you how well your GMP sanitation and hygienic practices are working. So again, trying to measure the effectiveness of your preventative controls. And then lastly, I don't want to kill one of my customers or many of my customers, and I certainly don't want to go to jail. FDA is helping us a little bit in defining how to install an effective environmental monitoring program. And they've done this through a proposed guidance document titled Control of Listeria Monocytogenes in Ready-to-Eat Foods. And this is the citation where you can find it. You just go on the FDA website and it's easily accessible. And what this guidance document, it's very specific for ready-to-eat foods that are exposed to the environment prior to packaging, where there is no subsequent Listeria monocytogenes control measure that could significantly minimize risk. So in this document, FDA is recommending testing both contact surfaces, vis-a-vis Zone 1, and non-contact surfaces at each sampling time. And they recommend collecting these samples at a time several hours into production and preferably just before cleaning. So those of you who are manufacturing a product that has no kill step in the process and is manufactured from ingredients where you know you're bringing Listeria in on those ingredients, think about what you're going to do with those data points, because the odds are pretty decent you're going to find Listeria on those surfaces if you are testing several hours into production and before cleaning and sanitation. So what are some risk-based preventative corrective actions if you have an out-of-spec environmental monitoring data point? So some questions you should be asking is the environmental contamination on a Zone 1 surface or your direct product contact surface? And if you are, that tells you you've got a potential issue. Is this contamination an isolated positive result? Or is this location have a past history of multiple repeats or multiply occurring positive results? So if it's the latter, that is suggestive you've got a harbored site on that surface or very near that surface where the pathogen is persistently being shed on those surfaces. And then if you're only looking at non-contact surfaces, and you find a positive on those surfaces, how close is that surface to Zone 1, and what kinds of activities or behaviors could allow for that out-of-spec surface to be a vector to get onto Zone 1 surface? So if there's reasonable likelihood that that contamination could happen, then that should tell you that that Zone 2 or that non-contact surface is a high-risk surface. And then, does the product support growth of the pathogen of concern if it does get into the product prior to final package closure? So if you're just using Listeria species as your indicator on those zone 1 surfaces, here are some things you should do. So obviously you need to remediate that surface. So you need to clean and sanitize that area that has the positive test results. You need to immediately retest that site during the next production cycle. And then you need to consider vector sampling around that contaminated area, because if you're not doing a large number of sampling in that area, all you currently know with that data point is that particular surface that was sampled on that day is contaminated. You don't know if adjacent surfaces are contaminated. You don't know if there was a complete sanitation failure, if you've got issues with your GMPs. All you know is that site was contaminated, and you know nothing about potentially other nearby sites. So you really need to do lots of vector sampling, lots of investigated sampling around that hotspot. And then you need to do a comprehensive investigation to determine how widespread is that contamination using those data points. And then once you have remediated the site and follow-up testing demonstrates that, then you can return to routine testing. However, if you keep getting positive test results on that location, you really need to rethink whether or not you are correctly managing the risk at those locations. And you should consider altering your SOPs, or perhaps even fixing or removing the equipment at those locations. So if that retest then result is positive, again, do intensify cleaning and sanitation, do a lot more investigational monitoring, begin test and hold procedure for product, because right now you've got sound evidence that that surface is contaminated. If product is touching that surface, then it's reasonable to assume that product also is contaminated. So if you're doing end product testing, obviously those data points will help you answer that question. But unless you're testing large sample volumes out of that production lot, you may be missing very low levels of contamination. And then you really need to, again, do this investigational sampling. All right, so all that information is from that Listeria guidance document, so I encourage you to read that document and think about how much of that applies to your situation. If Salmonella is the pathogen of concern in your product and your process, remember that Salmonella does not need to grow in the food product to be a food safety risk. So if it's ready to eat, one cell on that ounce of food that is consumed by a high-risk consumer, that person could get sick. Listeria can establish growth niches on environmental surfaces. Salmonella could potentially do the same if it's a wet manufacturing environment. But Salmonella is usually found in the environment due to a GMP or a hygienic preventative controls failure. And this can include things like environmental contamination due to vermin. You've got a leaky roof, and you've got birds nesting on the roof, and when it rains, the Salmonella and the bird poop gains entry into your facility. So those would be some classic examples. I already talked about Listeria, Salmonella surviving for a long time when it's dry. But if you do find Salmonella on these zone 1 surfaces or even zone 2 surfaces, your risk-based corrective actions that we just described for Listeria are essentially the same. Initiate your seek and destroy mission. Genevieve, if we could go on to the second polling question, see how many folks are still with us.
I'll leave the poll open for about a minute. and I'll release another poll question. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. And Doug, you can continue.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for participating in the polls. I really appreciate it. And hopefully your collective wisdom is meaningful to you. So I'm going to finish up this webinar by giving you a few case studies, because again, the whole question and the premise for this webinar is, should I or should I not be testing for pathogens on Zone 1 surfaces? And I want to give you some examples of some folks that have decided that Zone 1 testing may be not for me, and what are the potential risks and outcomes of those decisions. So in this first one, it's a question that we often get. I'm doing ATP monitoring of my direct contact surfaces because it's quick, it's easy, I can do it in the plant, I get real-time results, and all that is great and wonderful. And you set some arbitrary relative light unit as your action level that's appropriate for your product and your process. If those are the only data points and you have no kind of validation data that correlates the ATP levels with pathogen prevalence, then that leaves you open to criticism when you're visited by an auditor, inspector, or a customer who says, so that's great that you're monitoring ATP. What does that tell us about the presence of pathogens or not? So again, my question to you, and you don't have to answer this in a chat box, but how do you rebut that criticism unless you have done that validation work? So that's going to be my answer, is use the data. If the validation data does not show that correlation, then I think it's going to be difficult for you to rebut that question. And you could use the same thing, the same outcome for whether using other indicators. Let's say you're using quantitative microbial indicators like ATP, or in the first polling question, you're using EBAC counts. Simple question is EBAC correlated with Salmonella prevalence? If it is, great. If it's not, then perhaps that's not the greatest indicator for you. Okay, mid-shift testing. Again, the FDA guidance document for Listeria control and ready-to-eat foods, they recommend doing mid-shift EMP testing. So in this scenario, let's say you're a fresh produce manufacturer and you don't have a very effective kill step in your process, and you know that fresh produce coming in your facility, there's a reasonable likelihood that you will be bringing in Listeria on those raw materials. And so if you're going to do mid-shift testing, what is that environmental data point going to tell you? Is it going to tell you that, yes, I know I'm bringing Listeria in on the raw materials? Yes, I know that Listeria could get on those Zone 1 surfaces. But how are you going to react to that data point? So this is a little bit different than if you're using Listeria testing to verify whether your cleaning and sanitation operation eliminated Listeria from those surfaces. And in that case, you would want to do that after cleaning and sanitation, perhaps as a pre-op data point. But in this case, you're following FDA guidance, and you're going to do that mid-production sampling point. So what are you going to do with that data point, and how is that going to impact whether or not you release that product, and whether or not you have to do investigational sampling, and whether or not you have to do corrective actions and so forth. Here's another scenario for you to contemplate. You've got a non-contact surface pathogens hit. So in this case, you've rationalized that I don't want to look for pathogens on Zone 1. And instead, I'm going to do zone 2 testing. So if you verify sanitation then by looking at these non-contact surfaces and you find a pathogen, what are you going to do? Are you just going to remediate that zone 2 surface and ignore the zone 1 areas that might be in close proximity? Or are you going to do aggressive investigational monitoring on zone 1? Clearly, given what we've talked about, you know what my advice would be. But again, this is your discretion, not mine, on what would you do. So we've got a situation that's relatively recently, and that's the Bluebell ice cream outbreak. And they recalled frozen treats. So again, this is a product that's ready to eat. But if you would look at somebody's hazard analysis making ice cream, you know, one of the lower risk contemplations you might think about, well, it's frozen ice cream. Listeria is not going to grow in that. I've got a pasteurization step in the process, so I have a kill step. This is a low risk product. I'm not going to worry too much about it. And so Bluebell did have an environmental monitoring program, and they had a history of finding Listeria in non-contact surfaces. So they were aware they had Listeria in their environment, but their corrective actions were ineffective. So they didn't really do aggressive investigational sampling on zone 1 areas. And so some of the, and they weren't doing end product testing, because end product test results showed that multiple samples from production lot, in fact, most of those were in fact contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes. So this is a scenario where a company in their risk assessment decided zone 1 testing was not appropriate for them, and they caused an outbreak. And they were out of business for many months trying to do remediation. Okay, another case study. This one is in order to validate whether or not your indicators are appropriate, you might want to periodically do a pathogen test just to make sure that that correlation is effective. And when you pull that data point, all of a sudden it pops for the pathogen of concern. So in this case, that surface would have passed your spec limit for your indicator, but when you did that verification test for the pathogen, it pops. What are your implications then on product that's been manufactured on that surface and has passed based on that indicator count? Do you have a gigantic recall scenario under your belt? And here's another example of a situation like this. This is Sunland Foods. And I pulled out one of their 483 reports from FDA. And they had, I think, 4 or 5 successive years of 483s, and they all basically said the same thing. And these were some things that contributed to a contamination event over multiple products that they were manufacturing. So they had GMP problems, they had lots of problems, and these are just some examples that they got written up for. And what happened was they were implicated in a multi-state outbreak. There were 42 confirmed cases of salmonellosis. Multiple big brands were buying these products from this manufacturer, and these were all ready-to-eat products. And company testing had a test history of finding multiple serotypes of Salmonella in their facility. And as a result of that, there is a lawsuit pending that FDA is suing Sunland for this scenario. So again, I don't want to go to jail. Might be a pretty good reason to do zone 1 testing. Here's another one that occasionally occurs, and if you're involved in these, you know your stress level goes way up. So one day you're confronted by a regulatory inspection team ready to do a super swabbing event in your facility. So the first question is why me? So why is FDA spending their precious resources coming in and doing a super swabbing event in my facility? What is their rationale? And if the answer is, well, it was just your turn on the list, that might be perhaps a little naivete on your part thinking that's the reason. So maybe they're investigating an outbreak and they're linking it to a particular product type. Maybe they're linking it to your product. You may not necessarily know, but they're there for a reason. And so you might hear some people in the industry say, well, if that's the case, you need to follow that FDA team or that state inspection team and swab each location they're swabbing and test for the same thing they're testing for. So if you're doing that and you're testing for pathogens and it pops for a positive test result, what are you going to do with that information? So now you've just created a situation where you've got to do corrective actions based on your own testing. And then if your test data is not the same as FDA's test data, what does that mean for you? Does that give you any reason to argue with FDA? I would say perhaps not. So make sure you understand in your environmental monitoring program when and why you may or may not want to do this follow-on sampling during a super swabbing event. So I'm going to conclude by quickly going over, again, how to remediate if you do zone 1 testing and you find an out-of-spec result, what you should be doing for it. So first and foremost, you need to determine what are the product contamination risks if I find the zone 1 testing. So you're going to do test and hold. You're going to test a bunch of that product to make sure that it is in fact not contaminated. You're going to, if it is, and you have a kill step, there are a lot of things you could do. You could perhaps reprocess it if the kill step was used. But what if your kill step preventative control wasn't working? Now you're just going to recontaminate an already contaminated product, perhaps by reprocessing. So you could destroy the product, you could divert it to another use where that contamination is not an issue. And then again, increased inspectional monitoring. Corrective actions, make sure you limit access to the area so you're not tracking contamination all over the rest of the plants. Break down any high-risk equipment nearby, thoroughly clean and sample, and then make sure you vector monitor around that. If your pre-op inspection fails or your subsequent test data shows it's still out of spec, don't restart production until you get it back under control. Corrective actions, generally people say 3 successive in-spec results after a remediation is enough data points to allow you to go back to putting that site back into your routine verification monitoring plan. If you get repeat positives, then you really need to consider removal, replacement, or redesign of that contaminated direct product contact surface. Remember that all the analytical methods that we're using to get data points assume that the target analyte in question, so in this case, in this particular figure, I've shown that a dash here in one of these boxes is a microbial cell, or let's say it's Salmonella or Listeria. And the grids here might represent a facility grid map. It could also represent a production lot, and these are all the 25 sample pull points you might have. But the methods assume that the target analyte is uniformly distributed. And if it's there in a very low level, in other words, if the prevalence rate is there at a really low population level, what are the odds if you pull one sample in this particular example that you would find it? And you can take these slides and get a little electronic pointer, close your eyes and just point it at the screen and see how many times it would take you pulling a sample from this grid to find that one sample that has the Salmonella or Listeria. Also, even under scenarios where you might have a high population size, if the analyte is not uniformly distributed, in this case, this could be your production floor, and you've got just a couple of hot spots, but in your routine monitoring, you are not choosing those grids for sampling. You're going to miss those every time you do routine monitoring. So the odds of actually finding it when you do are pretty low. So it's better for you to do investigational monitoring to find these kinds of hot spots before they cause a problem than after. So again, I want to thank everyone for their time and attention. I really do appreciate that this is a controversial topic. Unfortunately, on a 1-hour webinar, I cannot give each one of you specific advice on how to do this. But hopefully you'll submit some follow-up questions, and we'll take some time and follow up with you on those. And Genevieve, we may have time for a couple of questions.
All right. So the first question that we will cover is pathogenic E. coli an environmental pathogen of concern?
Okay. E. coli can be a pathogen of concern. It could certainly come into the facility on raw materials and ingredients. Certainly, E. coli is a commonly found in the intestinal tracts of the workers that are in your facility. And I've had scenarios where environmental contamination of finished product happened because of E. coli establishing a foothold in a facility. So the answer is absolutely yes. It really depends on your product, your process, and how well your preventative controls are working.
Okay, one more question. If I find Listeria species on a zone 1 surface, but it does not speciate out to Listeria monocytogenes, is it okay to ship product?
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's repeat that question. If you find Listeria on a zone 1 surface, and it's your company practice to go ahead and attempt to speciate that Listeria positive, so you're going to do culture confirmation and then identify whether or not what you pull off of those plates is Listeria mono or not. If it comes back as some other species, some companies make the decision that they can go ahead and ship product. Remember that something like Listeria inocula can outcompete monocytogenes in the testing. So when it gets down to confirmation of species, there could have been mono on that surface, but if there's also another species there like Listeria inocula, it can outcompete mono such that we cannot recover it during confirmation, and the test result will come back as saying it's Listeria inocula, yet that surface could already have contaminated product with mono. So I think it's fairly risky to practice that kind of behavior.
Okay, well, we have 2 minutes remaining, so I'm going to do another question. The question is, if we have a robust kill step with just seconds of air exposure to the heated product, would that affect the zone 1 strategy?
Okay. In this question, there is a kill step in the product, but the product is exposed for a very short amount of time. Let's use the pasteurized milk example. The risk is really going to be defined on the product parameters and what temperature that product is after it exits the kill step and before final package closure. So if you could maintain a kill temperature of that product in that exposure zone, then perhaps that kill step extends into the final package closure step. But the only way to really measure that risk is you really should do some investigational sampling around that exposure area, and those data points will help you define that risk for whatever pathogen you think is reasonable to target.
Okay, thank you, Doug. That wraps up our Q&A session. I want to remind everyone that a recording of the webinar along with a copy of the slides will be available to them within the next 2 business days. Thank you, Doug, for sharing your expertise in your presentation, and thank you, SafetyChain, for inviting us to participate. Thanks, everyone, for attending.